Ever wondered what really happens when a check bounces? I mean, it's not just some minor financial hiccup. It actually kicks off a whole complex legal journey. In this explainer, we're going to break down the entire life cycle of a check bounce case. This is going to give you the essential knowledge you need, whether you're a law student cramming for exams or you're just curious about how this part of the legal world really works.
So where do we even begin? Well, here's our roadmap. We're going to follow this thing from start to finish. We'll start by figuring out who's actually responsible when a company's check bounces. Then we'll walk through the trial, the appeals system, and even see how different legal cases can run at the exact same time. Let's dive in. Okay, first things first. When a company writes a check that bounces, it's not as simple as just blaming the company itself. We have to figure out which people are legally on the hook. So, who is it? The law doesn't just stop at the company's name on the building. It does something called piercing the corporate veil to find the actual individuals who are pulling the strings behind the scenes. The basic principle here is that anyone who is in charge of the company's business gets held accountable. If they knew what was happening or if they just weren't careful enough to prevent it, they're in trouble. So the big takeaway for any director is this. Your best defense is to prove you weren't involved in the day-to-day stuff and that you did everything you could. That's how you avoid being held vicariously liable.
But, and this is a big but, there's a really crucial exception to this rule. Directors of corporations owned by the government, they're actually shielded from liability in these check bounce cases. That's a key distinction you've got to remember. And there's this landmark case, Anil Hada versus Indian Acrylic Limited, that just illustrates this perfectly. It sets up three distinct categories of people who can be liable. First, you've got the company itself, the legal entity. Second, all the key people who are responsible for its daily business. And third, any officer whose neglect or, active help allowed the whole thing to happen.
So picture this. A director tries to wash their hands of a bounced check. They say, hey, I didn't sign it. Well, the courts have a very clear answer for that one. It is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. The Pankaj Jain case made it crystal clear that responsibility is shared. All right, so now that we know who can be held responsible, let's look at how the person holding that bounced check can actually start the legal action. This is where the process really kicks into high gear. Before a court will even agree to hear a case, there are certain boxes that have to be ticked. The complaint must be in writing, it has to be filed by the right person, that's either the payee or a holder in due course, which is just someone who legally got the check from the original payee. And, of course, it's got to be submitted to the right court. It's basically a checklist for just getting your foot in the door.
And you've got to be quick about it. The law sets a really strict 1-month deadline to file a complaint after the incident. If you miss that window, you're going to need a very good excuse to convince the court to still hear your case. And here's a smart rule to make the whole system a lot more efficient. Section 142A says that if one person has a bunch of check bounce cases against them in different courts, all of those cases can be bundled together and heard by the single court where the very first case was filed. Okay, so the case is officially in court, but what does the trial actually look like? Let's step into the courtroom and find out. To stop these cases from dragging on forever, Section 143 allows for something called a summary trial. It's a much faster procedure, but it has its limits. The most you can get is 1 year in prison and a 5,000 rupee fine. The whole point is to get it all wrapped up within 6 months. Now, a key concept you'll hear in these trials is prima facie evidence. It just means that the evidence is accepted as true at first glance. Think of it like this. On the surface, it looks like solid proof, but it can still be challenged and, proven wrong later on.
And a perfect example of prima facie evidence? The bank's return slip. That little piece of paper that says insufficient funds, that is incredibly powerful proof that the check bounced. Honestly, it's often a complete game changer in the courtroom. But the trial isn't just about proving guilt. It's also about getting the money back, right? And the court actually has the power to order payments even before a final verdict is reached.
So get this. Under Section 143A, as soon as the accused person pleads not guilty, the court can order them to pay something called interim compensation to the person with the bad check. And this amount can be up to 20% of the original check's value.
And they don't get forever to pay it either. There's a strict timeline. It has to be paid within 60 days, although they might get another 30-day extension if the court agrees. This whole system makes sure the person who got the bad check gets some financial relief, and fast. But, this story doesn't always end with the trial court's decision. What happens if the person who wrote the check is found guilty and decides to appeal?
Well, filing an appeal isn't exactly free. The court can make the person appealing deposit at least 20% of the fine or compensation they were ordered to pay. And here's the kicker. This deposit is on top of any interim compensation they might have already paid. Of course, the system has a safety net for fairness. If the person appealing actually wins their case and is acquitted, the court will order that deposit to be returned to them. And not just the original amount, but with interest, calculated at whatever the RBI bank rate is at the time. Finally, there's one last really important thing to wrap your head around. This whole criminal process doesn't happen in a bubble. It can actually run right alongside other legal actions.
So the law allows for both criminal and civil cases to run at the same time. See, the criminal case is there to punish the act of bouncing a check, while the civil case is all about recovering the money. They're two different tracks, but they're both heading toward the same goal, justice.
And that leaves us with one final question to think about. Does having this dual-track system really ensure complete justice for the victim of a bounced check? Or does it risk making the path to a final resolution way more complicated and dragged out? It's definitely something to consider.